Scarcity. Japan used to save more than almost any country on Earth. Now it doesn't. There is a word in Japanese that has no direct English translation, mottainai. It means, roughly, what a waste, but the feeling it describes is more than that. It is a physical discomfort, almost a moral grief at the sight of something useful being discarded or squandered. For decades, economists looking at Japan could not explain what they were seeing. A country firebombed into rubble in 1945 rebuilt itself in a single generation into the second largest economy on Earth. And while it did this, its households saved at rates that defied standard economic theory. Above 15% of disposable income for 25 consecutive years. Papers were published asking whether Japan was saving too much. That era is over. In 2024, Japan's household saving rate was 4.1% of disposable income, lower than Germany, lower than the United Kingdom, barely above the United States. The country the world called the greatest saver in history now saves less than most of Europe. What happened? And what does Japan's story, both the rise and the fall, tell you about why any society saves at all? The answer is not mottainai, or rather, mottainai is real and it matters, but it is not sufficient on its own. Japan's high saving era happened because three conditions arrived simultaneously. A traumatic scarcity event that rewired the psychology of an entire generation. An institutional architecture that made saving the default behavior, and a cultural layer that made savings feel like the morally correct thing to do. All three together produced the phenomenon. Remove any one of them and it collapses. Start with the trauma. In 1945, 67 of Japan's major cities had been firebombed. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya reduced largely to ash. The atomic bombings followed. Then came occupation, rationing, and years of material deprivation. The generation that rebuilt Japan had experienced something that leaves a specific signature on a nervous system. Genuine uncertainty about whether there would be food tomorrow. Psychological research on war and famine survivors shows the same pattern regardless of the country. Heightened risk aversion, a preference for tangible, accessible reserves, cash, rice, and land over paper wealth or future promises. An almost irrational resistance to spending even when spending is economically rational, because the body remembers what happened the last time everything seemed fine. That generation raised children. Research on intergenerational trauma transmission shows that the financial psychology does not die with the survivors. It travels through stories, through modeled behavior, through the unspoken message passed from parent to child. We almost did not make it, and we will not be caught unprepared again. The same pattern is documented in Depression-era American cohorts, whose higher savings rates and lower equity exposure persisted for decades after the Depression itself ended. Trauma creates the orientation. But what turns a traumatized generation into a nation of habitual savers is not willpower. It is architecture. Institutions make the orientation effortless. Japan Post was not simply a postal service. At its peak, it was the largest financial institution on Earth. By the mid-2000s, it held the equivalent of roughly $1.7 trillion in household savings, approximately 25% of all household financial assets in Japan, distributed across more than 20,000 post offices, reaching every town in the country, including rural communities with no access to commercial banks. Picture a Japanese parent in the 1970s walking their child to the local post office and opening a savings passbook together. It was a standard rite of passage. Fee-free, government-backed, tax-advantaged, available within walking distance of almost every home in the country. The friction of saving was close to zero. The friction of not saving was invisible until it became social. The money did not sit idle. It flowed into the fiscal investment and loan program, a government mechanism that channeled household deposits directly into infrastructure and national development. In the early 1990s, this program managed the equivalent of $2.3 trillion. Japanese households were not just saving for themselves. Institutionally, they were building the country, and that framing reinforced the act. Before Japan Post, there were tanumoshi, rotating savings associations in which groups of trusted community members pooled regular contributions, each member receiving a lump sum in turn. They date to the Kamakura period, centuries before formal banking existed. They worked not because participants had exceptional willpower, but because non-participation meant social failure. Saving was embedded inside obligation. Architecture, not self-discipline. And then there is the cultural layer, the third force, and the one most people assume is the whole explanation. Mottainai, ma, and haji are not a separate triad. They are the cultural component of the same three-force system, the layer that makes the institutional habit feel like a personal virtue. Mottainai turns spending into loss. Wasting money is not poor optimization, but moral failure. Ma, the Japanese aesthetic of meaningful gaps and restraint, provides the cultural counterpart to patience, the comfort of not yet acquiring, of finding sufficiency in what exists. And haji, the emotion of shame, operates as a social regulator. Research on haji shows it is triggered not just by moral violations, but by standing out, appearing boastful, or troubling others. In a society where group harmony is paramount and much is communicated implicitly, visible excess risks social friction. Quiet financial prudence is the safer path to belonging. These three cultural scripts do not cause saving. They remove the resistance to it. They make it feel not like sacrifice, but like maturity. Notice how different that is from the way saving is framed in many Western contexts, as delayed gratification, as self-denial, as a form of sacrifice you impose on your present self for the benefit of your future self. In Japan, the cultural architecture made the same behavior feel like wisdom, not deprivation. The behavior was identical. The emotional experience of it was completely different. But culture, it turns out, has limits. Charles Horioka, the economist who has spent most of his career studying Japanese saving behavior, identifies two forces that drove the collapse. First, demographics. Japan's population aged faster than almost any society in history. Retired households spend down savings rather than accumulate them. When the ratio of elderly to working-age people shifts dramatically, aggregate household saving falls arithmetically regardless of mottainai. By 2014, Japan's household saving rate had fallen to negative 11.7%. Japanese households were, on balance, consuming more than they earned. The cultural scripts had not changed. The age structure had. Second, the institutional architecture was dismantled. Consumer credit became available. Social insurance expanded. Japan Post was partially privatized, removing the tax advantages, separating deposits from the FELP investment machinery, and introducing more complex financial products in place of a single, simple passbook. The system that made saving the path of least resistance was gradually taken apart. And once the friction of not saving decreased, the cultural layer alone was insufficient to hold the rate steady. Not slowly, sharply. This is what the Japanese data is actually teaching. What looked like a unified cultural phenomenon was three forces operating in concert. Remove two of the three, and the behavior changed dramatically. The cross-country pattern confirms this logic. Look at the highest saving societies today through the same three-force lens. Legal compulsion. Singapore's domestic saving rate is 58.5% of GDP, driven by the Central Provident Fund, mandatory contributions that flow into retirement, housing, and medical accounts by law. The institutional force is so strong it almost renders the others secondary. Institutional insecurity. China saves at 44.4% of GDP, where limited social safety nets and high costs for healthcare and education compel households to accumulate reserves the state will not reliably provide. Conservative culture plus welfare infrastructure. Germany, at around 25%, shows that high saving can coexist with strong public institutions when cultural norms favor long-term prudence and institutional design supports it. 3 different countries, 3 dominant mechanisms, the same underlying architecture. Your own financial behavior, whatever form it currently takes, is not a personality trait. It is the intersection of what you experienced or inherited, what the systems around you make easy or hard, and what your community treats as responsible or reckless. Japan did not change its values between 1986 and 2014. It changed 2 of the 3 structural conditions that made those values translate into behavior. Which of the 3 is shaping you right now? And which one would be the most useful to change?